My experience at this conference has been very, very positive. I spoke 2 years ago, and I'm here again this year. It's a very positive, friendly, and research-based approach that is delightful and fairly typical of Indiana, which to me has a lot of very sensible, highly professional people.
One of the things I thought was great about this conference is the folks who plan it, when they reached out to invite people like me to come and talk, they were able to actually share some data about what people in this state most want to learn about. And I was thrilled to see that folks here want to know about RTI. They want to know about how to help all children grow, and then how to use those data to make resource allocation decisions. And I thought that was great for a state conference to bring folks in to share information that people in your state have indicated they want to learn about.
Well, it seems to have many national experts here to talk in their particular areas of expertise. So it's been fun for me to be able to interact with the colleagues I know from around the country, some of the folks whose work I read and who inform my own work. So it seems to have the right folks here talking about the right topics, and I would say not only the right folks with the right expertise, but also topics that are very timely for the implementation of multi-tiered service delivery.
It's a great experience. It's a good group of individuals who are coming to it. It's a great group of presenters. I was really impressed at the individuals who you guys attracted to come to it, and the sessions have been enjoyable. There's been good questions from the individuals attending. It's been a really positive experience.
We need to make sure that our special education programs actually pay off for kids. That's why we provide those programs for children. Our challenge today is to use the research that we have, because we have research now. All those years ago, we didn't have research. We knew what didn't work, but we didn't know what did work, and now we do. We have a good idea of what evidence-based practices are, what research-based practices are. Our challenge now is to get them into classrooms and implement them with a high degree of fidelity.
If you look through legal lenses as to what are the current issues that face courts, hearing officers, state complaint processes, OCR, you find that some of them include response to intervention, also known as MTSS. Bullying is a very significant issue. Eligibility of children with emotional disturbance is a thorny issue. FAPE cases, that is, cases involving whether a child is receiving free, appropriate public education, not only procedural and substantive, but the new issues tend to be implementation of a kid's IEP. Discipline tends to be a fairly hot topic when it comes to things like restraint or seclusion, although some people would say that's not part of discipline. Finally, the remedies, including attorney's fees, compensatory education, and tuition reimbursement, are all significant issues in special education law at this time.
We have won the access fight. Kids are included. We've gotten kids in school. We can demonstrate that they have access to opportunities to learn. And now it's about demonstrating and redefining what access and equity really means, and focusing on making sure that all kids grow. The outcomes for kids in special education have, especially in the category of specific learning disability, have not been good. And that's not okay. It's wonderful that they are included in classrooms, but now we need to make sure that they grow at faster rates as a result of being exposed to specialized instruction. We need to figure out how to help the children who are most vulnerable. So those are the children for whom very intensive interventions that we might provide through a Tier 3 layer of service have not worked. To me, that's the next big question, is how to reach the 2% and help them grow, help them have better outcomes.
So some of the most important issues in special ed right now, as we're continuing to transition from a traditional to a more contemporary approach to disability identification and eligibility, relate to how we identify those children. So in terms of the law, child find continues to be a very important aspect of what we're doing, especially in terms of systematically screening using a variety of approaches that are highly efficient so they're not too intrusive on instruction. But then there are even more substantial challenges in terms of identifying the most effective instructional approaches, and then to evaluate whether or not those instructional approaches are effective for an individual student, so that we can monitor and respond to the progress monitoring data in a way that optimizes instruction and gives us the most likely impact for students, even those students that are the most challenging.
In terms of the changing population, in my mind, which is one reason that I was invited to participate, I think, because we have a great diversity of kids coming up through our systems that the older system and the older structures were not prepared to deal with. It's who we're talking about and how we're addressing them and how we even think about students with these very complex profiles. And in my field, that's a case of linguistically and culturally diverse background. Children from very, very different backgrounds and from family structures and with experience histories that are very different from the mainstream population, and indeed from most of the kids that the research is all based on. And so to me, that is a hot emerging issue in special education, which has a well-developed history and tradition of certain procedural things, which are now emerging and changing, but are going to have to be modified and accommodate these unique convergence of needs that come up with linguistically and culturally diverse kids.
When I think about important issues in special education, I think I would focus on first use of data to make effective decisions. People in education collect a lot more data now, but we're often using the wrong data for different decisions. We use data which is available to make a decision rather than collecting a data source that actually matches the question that we want to answer. So for example, if we want to do progress monitoring of a student's behavior, it doesn't make sense to just go pick a screener item or a diagnostic tool and try to use that. We need to actually use data sources that make sense for progress monitoring purposes. I think the other large issue is special education and regular education's understanding of what evidence-based interventions are, and how when they're done correctly, they still have a very large fail rate. They're often ineffective because of their complexity. They're much like medicines. Often medicines don't work, so you try a different medicine. Schools need to be prepared to have a long list of options of evidence-based procedures related to the particular function, the problem that the child is having. And they need to prepare to shift in and out of interventions as the data suggests they're becoming less effective, or intensifying intervention when we see a minor effect, but we would like to increase that. So that's really, I think, the critical issue. So we've dealt with some of the understanding of what we should be doing in schools, but our technical proficiency with working with data and really understanding how to use evidence-based interventions, I think there's a lot of room for growth.
What's challenging for me is that there's a lot of research that needs to be done over the next number of years to get further specific about whether or not the practices that we are using actually will work with students. Much of what we've done has been, the research that we've done has been basic kind of research, and not research that has really scaled up into programs. The other thing that's happening is we have many, many commercially available products that have been based on good research. Question is whether or not those products, when they're implemented in schools, will work as well in schools as they do in the research. So we're going to be watching that over the next number of years. And while we're watching it, what school folks have to get a handle on is whether it works for them. They need to be evaluating their programs, evaluating the products and materials they use, evaluating how easy it is or difficult it is for teachers to use those products, because ultimately what we have to be aware of is whether or not those products are going to work when they're used with kids in actual situations.
So recent research with respect to progress monitoring and data use in schools suggests that we should not use one source of data, that we really should be using a combination of computer adaptive tests, which are broad measures of reading and math achievement, in combination with general outcome measures such as curriculum-based measurement reading, curriculum-based measurement math, in combination with sub-skill mastery measures, which would target the specific skills that we intend to change as we implement supplemental and intensive supports, and we structure special education programs and monitor student progress on their IEP goals. So the research has become very clear that it's not that you use one measurement system for all purposes, because one measurement system doesn't serve all purposes, but that we align the measurement system with the question and the purpose of assessment. In addition to that, I would also comment that we've come to realize that progress monitoring data, where we're evaluating whether or not a student is making adequate growth towards their intent goals, is a much more challenging activity that requires a much more a higher level of sophistication than I think was once realized. So as we continue to have conferences like this and we talk about those most challenging issues, I think we really have the opportunity to change practice, and which will confer improved benefit to students with and without disabilities.
Well, some of the newest research is, in a sense, it's a paucity of research about these diverse learners with special needs. But the emerging research, we are getting a larger and larger number of kids from diverse cultural and language populations into the special education process. So we have more and more understanding of the way in which these factors integrate with one another. And so some of the new emerging research looks specifically at how the dynamic of acculturation and language transition intersect with this variety of special needs issues. So this is an emerging area. Now, in the past, the research did look at this in terms of assessment or in terms of instruction, and it was all this kind of, well, how do we identify? But now we, in addition, even if you cleaned up assessment, even if you cleaned up earlier instructional models, now what do you do with dual labeled children or triple? I mean, we have these very complex service profiles, instructional profiles, family profiles that make for a huge gap in our research. I mean, there isn't any research, very limited background on it. There is some emerging research to look at, but it's very, very scanty, and that's the hot issue in my field.
So some newer research finding which are interesting. I'm just thinking of some stuff that's being presented at this conference. I'm presenting something called direct behavior rating, which is a behavior assessment method that was developed by Sandy Shafoulias and myself and T.Chris, which really lays down a very easy model for teachers to collect outcome data on a daily basis for kids who are having behavioral difficulties and track that. Ted was doing some really interesting presentations and research on some of our advanced understanding of what curriculum-based measurement can and really what it can't do, understanding some of the limitations so that you're using that data in a truly effective manner. I think one area of interest that Amanda and Joe Kovaleski presented on here is really technically understanding how you use RTI to actually look at eligibility decisions for kids. I think a lot of the RTI focuses on intervention and trying to help kids, but it's obviously a funding mechanism. And so that point of when do we call a child disabled within an RTI process has been a little vague and ambiguous, and some of the stuff that they're presenting gives some real clarification on how that really should be done.
Among other findings, one is that adjudication or litigation in special ed law, when you look at it empirically, reveals that there are two worlds of special education law. One world are states like my state, Pennsylvania, along with New York, New Jersey, the District of Columbia, California, and more recently Hawaii, which account for currently a group of 9 states account for 88% of all of the cases. Indiana, on the other hand, is in the other world, the majority of states where people still understand common sense, trust, and are not as litigious. Although that's therapeutic, it also forewarns me and others that we do not want to necessarily import all of the precedents that I talk about from the more litigious states to this state. It is good to know what's happening elsewhere and to avoid those problems, but not to sort of mimic and replicate the legalized approach to solving issues in special education. A second research finding relating to trends of adjudication is that what we're finding in general is that due process hearings, which is the initial stage of adjudication, have finally reached the point of leveling off and now dropping off, which is, again, depending upon your perspective, a good or bad sign. To my perspective, it's a good sign. It means that we're maturing and we are taking an Indiana kind of approach more nationally to not resort to adjudication and to use alternative means of resolving disputes short of litigation. A third finding is that increasingly, when it comes to formal legal dispute resolution, there's more and more reliance on complaint investigations through the state complaint resolution process under the IDA and through the Office for Civil Rights under 504. The final research finding, which I would share with you here just to get a quick sampling, is 504. We're finding is that there's an increasing proportion of students who are eligible for a 504 plan rather than an IEP. If you ask why, the principal reason of the increase is that Congress amended 504 through the Americans with Disabilities Act in 2008, went into effect January 1, 2009, and law always has a more gradual rather than instant impact. And so when we look at 210 data, we find that increase now being evident, and it would be projected to continue to increase modestly as we get in compliance with the ADA amendments. Any of the issues we talked about being top issues in special education law need more empirical research using educational research techniques that are well established in education, but are not used very often on legal topics, so that we can answer your question more fully as far as what are the research findings about legal issues that help inform good practice for practitioners.
So there's a line of research looking at dosage, intervention dosage effects, and the reason that's helpful is it's very front line, and it helps teachers know what is the most efficient and effective way to help a child have a successful response to intervention. And so, for example, one finding that Robin Cotting has reported is that children who receive daily, shorter duration interventions have a better effect than children who receive the same amount of minutes of instruction, but they receive it in a single dose, like, for example, once per week. I think that's the kind of exciting, those are the kind of exciting data that are coming out that are helping us work smarter. I think one of the biggest mistakes that most places are making or trying to be thoughtful about how to help children learn. So they're well-intentioned, but the big mistake is over-assessment. So we are collecting way too much screening data. We are collecting concurrent measures that are highly correlated. They do not give us new information about kids. They do not make us more accurate. And what happens is it becomes a big distraction to all the adults involved, and the data are really not being attended to or responded to by the adults. So I think some of the screening research, some of mine, that people and others are reporting will help us work smarter, because we have to do less assessment if we're going to make time to really provide very intensive intervention to students. And we should consume the data. Most schools are drowning in data, and the very same children can't read or do math, and the teacher probably could have told you who they were before you started.